This episode is sponsored by Biff's Pleasure Paradise Hotel and Casino. Come explore Hill Valley, California's most famous resort. In this episode we will be investigating an alternate history scenario where the South is victorious in the American Civil War. This is simply one of many possibilities that could have occurred. In October 1862, President Abraham Lincoln went on one of his spur-of-the-moment strolls with his son Tad. Their walks through the National Mall and surrounding parks were fairly common, and the president had minimal protection. These outings allowed him a brief respite from the demands of the war and provided a connection with the city and its people on a more personal level. Little did Lincoln know that his recent issuance of the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, warning the Southern states of the consequences of their rebellion, had stoked the fire within the heart of a young man named John Wilkes Booth. Booth, a renowned actor who had managed to avoid military service, saw an opportunity to become a Southern hero and champion of their cause. As Lincoln and Tad strolled through Lafayette Square, Booth, consumed by hate, seized the moment. With a voice filled with bitter conviction, he shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," a Latin phrase meaning, "death to tyrants." The gunshot pierced the air, and chaos erupted. Lincoln tumbled to the ground, mortally wounded. Tad screamed for his father. Booth immediately fled into a nearby alleyway. Fueled by a mix of adrenaline and self-righteousness, he sprinted away from the scene. His horse was tied up on the opposite side of a group of townhouses. A determined pursuit ensued, led by a Pinkerton detective and a few nearby soldiers. Booth had managed to stay ahead until the fateful moment. With his horse in sight, two Union soldiers took aim and fired their muskets, striking Booth in the neck. As he crumpled to the ground, his life slipped away, sealing his place in history as a martyr in the eyes of many in the South. The loss of Lincoln at such critical juncture, following the issuance of the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, sent shockwaves through the Union. The consequences of this 1862 assassination would be far-reaching. At this point in history the Union Army had been relatively unsuccessful on the battlefield. The loss of such a strong leader could have had devastating consequences. In the wake of President Abraham Lincoln's assassination, the following weeks were marked by intense grief, national mourning, and a somber transition of power. Washington, D.C., the heart of the Union, became the focal point for the grieving process and the necessary transition of leadership. In this alternate history, as the nation mourned, Vice President Hannibal Hamlin assumed the role of president. In a solemn ceremony, Hamlin was sworn in as the 17th President of the United States. Aware of the immense responsibility placed upon him during this critical time, Hamlin vowed to uphold the principles and ideals for which Lincoln had fought. Hamlin began his political journey in the Democratic Party, serving as a member of the Maine House of Representatives and later in the Maine State Senate. In the 1840s, he shifted his allegiance to the newly formed Free Soil Party, which opposed the expansion of slavery. By 1856, Hamlin joined the Republican Party and played a prominent role in the emerging anti-slavery movement. He was elected as a U.S. Senator from Maine, serving from 1848 to 1857 and again from 1857 to 1861. In 1860, he was chosen as the running mate of Republican presidential candidate Abraham Lincoln. He became the 15th Vice President of the United States from 1861 to 1862, making him the first Republican Vice President in American history. Hannibal Hamlin's presidency began amid great uncertainty and national turmoil. He faced the daunting task of guiding the country through the ongoing Civil War and managing the aftermath of Lincoln's assassination. Hamlin, known for his political acumen and commitment to the Union cause, worked diligently to provide steady leadership during this tumultuous period. In the weeks that followed, the nation slowly emerged from the initial shock and grief. Political discussions and debates intensified, with voices from all sides clamoring for justice, unity, and the preservation of the Union. The memory of Abraham Lincoln in this history would be slightly different than in our timeline. His death, now occurring 3 years earlier, does not give him time to deliver the Emancipation Proclamation, give the Gettysburg Address, or see the war to its completion. He's a mourned leader that is remembered fondly but not with the same reverence as in our actual timeline. For some time, the nation seemed stuck in a funk. The cautious General George McClellan was the commander of the main Union force in the Eastern Theater, the Army of the Potomac. It seemed as though McClellan did little to engage the enemy before Lincoln's death. His passive nature only becomes more entrenched after the assassination. The new president also needed to balance the politics of the 1860s North. Congress was comprised of 3 groups: the Democratic Party, the moderate Republicans, and the radical Republicans. Much like Lincoln, Hamlin held strong anti-slavery views, but he was not aligned with the radical Republicans. The radical Republicans were known for their strong advocacy for civil rights for African Americans and their pursuit of more aggressive measures against the Confederate States. Hamlin lacked Lincoln's exceptional leadership abilities and charisma. The president finds himself grappling with the weighty responsibility of guiding the nation through a critical period. However, due to his more cautious nature and preference for continuity, Hamlin decided to delay the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln had planned to issue it in the near future. President Hamlin was also well aware that it was the announcement of the Emancipation Proclamation that drove Booth to assassinate Lincoln. Hamlin supported the measure but decided to hold off on its passage for the moment of Union military success. Furthermore, unlike Lincoln, Hamlin decides not to remove General George McClellan from command in the Eastern Theater. Hamlin believed the Army needed stability and continuity in leadership, allows McClellan to remain in place. This decision, aimed at avoiding further disruption and potential infighting within the Union Army, reflects Hamlin's cautious approach to change. Meanwhile, the city of Baltimore, already divided in its loyalties, experiences a resurgence of pro-Confederate sentiments following Lincoln's assassination. The loss of the president, coupled with the rising tensions and uncertainty of the war, fuels a renewed fervor among Confederate sympathizers in the city. Baltimore becomes a hotbed of dissent and a center for Confederate intelligence and subversive activities. Efforts are made to reinforce Union presence in the city, maintain order, and counteract Confederate influence. However, the deep-rooted divisions within Baltimore prove difficult to fully overcome, and the city remains a source of concern throughout Hamlin's presidency. After the Battle of Chancellorsville, General Lee's Confederate Army is emboldened advances northward. McClellan's forces began their pursuit of the Confederate Army that now was attempting to invade the Union. The slow slog by McClellan's forces meant that there was not a showdown at Gettysburg. In fact, Lee's forces managed to reach Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, before encountering a significant Union resistance. A Union garrison of 12,000 soldiers guarded the Pennsylvania state capital. Over a 2-day Lee's army of 55,000 laid siege to Harrisburg. The Union soldiers fought valiantly but were simply caught off guard and undermanned. Reinforcements from McClellan's Army of the Potomac were supposed to arrive soon. However, they would again be delayed due to the fact that the Confederate cavalry had blown 2 key railroad bridges from Washington. When word came that McClellan's men would arrive late, the evacuation of Harrisburg was ordered. Both civilians and the battered Union Army fled east by rail and by foot. This was a devastating blow to the U.S. The Confederate Army had officially captured a state capital within the Union. However, the victory was more of a psychological victory. Harrisburg was certainly a capital city, but not nearly as important as nearby Baltimore or Philadelphia. However, this victory also put Baltimore, a city already teeming with pro-Confederate sentiments, under increased threat. In Washington, President Hamlin faces a daunting challenge. Harrisburg did hold a strategic significance as a transportation hub. Its proximity to large Union cities was also problematic. Also, he saw that it was a great psychological victory for the South. The president was outraged at McClellan for not pursuing the Army of Northern Virginia closely enough. The entire Confederate invasion of the North could have been stopped before they crossed into Pennsylvania. Meanwhile, the absence of the decisive battle at Gettysburg alters the dynamics of the war. Lee knew that the counterattack against his men in Harrisburg would be severe. His supply lines had been stretched thin. Confederate forces had lived off civilians' food stocks and whatever they could pillage from the towns of southern Pennsylvania. Lee would make a fateful decision that will alter the outcome of the conflict. He decides to split his forces. General Lee leaves a garrison of approximately 8,000 soldiers along with the wounded in Harrisburg. He then leads the remainder of his 40,000-plus soldiers and flees west. McClellan strategized an all-out assault on the city of Harrisburg. His plan was to trap Lee and his army within the city and to pound them with artillery. The massive Union army would blast the city to the ground as they starved the Confederates of vital supplies. McClellan's army successfully recaptured Harrisburg. However, Lee's plan worked as he and the bulk of his army slipped back into Virginia. The men left behind were able to buy his army valuable time. The news of Harrisburg spreads like wildfire, sending shockwaves throughout the Union. The attack had just the psychological effect on the population that President Hamlin feared. It created a sense of vulnerability and uncertainty. It shattered the notion that the war was restricted to Southern soil. Nearly every Union newspaper cast doubts about the effectiveness of the Union's defenses and its ability to protect their homeland. The Confederacy's audacity and success in capturing a symbol of state power emboldened their supporters and generated a sense of triumph among those sympathetic to their cause. Many in the North called for an armistice. Others questioned the leadership of President Hamlin. The president was well aware that in less than a year, he would face re-election. The president also understood that in less than a year, he would face re-election. As Commander-in-Chief, the president faced the daunting task of restoring confidence in the Union. Hamlin made speeches, calls for unity, and promises of a swift and decisive response. In fact, Hamlin had a swift response of his own. Days after the disaster at Harrisburg, he removed General McClellan from command. The war raged on into 1864 as Hamlin desperately pushed his generals to trap Lee's army. But, neither side could gain a decisive advantage. However, news of the capture of Harrisburg had traveled across the Atlantic and a big shift was coming. Most of the success the Union was experiencing was in the Western Theater. Union General Ulysses S. Grant had successfully laid siege to the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg. This gave them near total control of the Mississippi River. While this was a significant victory, it occurred in a distant and less consequential theater. In March of 1864, a significant diplomatic challenge is posed to Hamlin. France and Great Britain officially recognized the Confederate States of America as an independent nation. The capture of a state capital so close to Washington gave the European powers reason to doubt the Union war effort. They also have been missing out on lucrative cotton deals. The recognition of the Confederacy by these European powers injects new complexities into the conflict. It provides the Confederacy with a degree of international legitimacy and opens up the possibility of foreign aid, both diplomatic and military. The Union, on the other hand, faces the diplomatic challenge of countering this recognition and rallying international support for their cause. In a move that may have been too little too late, Hamlin signs the Emancipation Proclamation in April of 1864. This document freed enslaved individuals held in Confederate territory. While it is celebrated by abolitionists, the Confederacy views it as a sign of desperation and weakness. It was a move meant to free the slaves, rally the people, win over the Europeans, and end the war. Unfortunately, it did not accomplish any of these aims. Without the Union Army present throughout the South, there was little Hamlin could do to enforce his proclamation. As the 1864 election approached, President Hamlin faced an uphill climb for re-election. He was challenged with taking over after Lincoln's assassination, demonstrating strong leadership, maintaining public support for the war effort, and countering the perception of weakness resulting from foreign recognition of the Confederacy. In this scenario, just as in real life, the fired General George McClellan becomes the Democratic candidate for president. McClellan's reputation as a military commander played a significant role in how he was perceived during the election. While he was widely respected for his organizational skills and the loyalty of his troops, his cautious approach and perceived slowness in taking decisive action drew criticism from both within and outside the military. Some viewed him as overly hesitant and overly protective of his troops, which led to frustrations among those who sought a more aggressive prosecution of the war. In terms of public perception, McClellan had a significant base of support, particularly among the war Democrats and those who believed in a negotiated settlement to end the war. He positioned himself as a moderate candidate who sought to reunite the country through a political settlement rather than continued military conflict. However, without decisive victories, and with so many issues still needing to be solved, George McClellan would walk away with a razor-thin victory. He would become the 18th President of the United States. McClellan's victory in the 1864 election marked a major turning point in the war and the political landscape. His campaign, focused on a promise to negotiate an end to the conflict, resonated with a war-weary population. The Union's recent successes on the battlefield, though significant, come too late to sway public toward continuing the war. It was clear that McClellan won because the citizens of the Union were tired of war. With his electoral mandate, President-elect McClellan moved swiftly to pursue peace negotiations. His administration began talks with Confederate representatives in an attempt to reach a mutually agreeable settlement. The war, which has claimed countless lives and drained the nation's resources, seemed to be on the brink of conclusion. However, negotiating a peace agreement proves to be a formidable challenge. The Confederacy, buoyed by foreign recognition and moderate battlefield success, took a hardened stance in the negotiations. They demand significant concessions and assurances. As peace talks unfold, divisions arise within the Union. Some factions support McClellan's pursuit of peace, eager to end the bloodshed. Others, particularly staunch abolitionists and Unionists, fear that a negotiated settlement would mean that hundreds of thousands of Union soldiers had died in vain. The Northern Radical Republicans are outraged over the peace treaty and fight back against many of President McClellan's decisions. However, they too feel the wrath of public sentiments. The negotiations and the terms of the peace agreement would take years to sort out. March 1865 marked the start of formal negotiations between representatives of the Union and the Confederacy. McClellan was sworn into office and immediately began taking steps to end the conflict. A ceasefire was agreed upon, and formal military operations were suspended. By the end of 1865, the United States officially acknowledges the Confederate States of America as a separate and independent nation. However, many disputes between the two nations that remained. Confederate President Jefferson Davis and his cabinet made many demands of the Union. At the time of the ceasefire, the Confederacy was made up of South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. However, the South did not have complete control of these states, portions of which were occupied by Union forces. This served as a bargaining chip for the North in negotiations. It's important to remember that the 9 states of the Confederacy were not the only states that allowed slavery. The Union contained 4 slave-holding border states with divided loyalties. These were Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky. West Virginia had been carved from Virginia during the war and would eventually become a Union state. This was an isolated portion of the state of Virginia that had very few slaveholders. Its mountainous terrain was not suitable for agriculture. Unionism was strong in this region. The Confederacy accepted this fact, and did not attempt to regain control there. However, the Confederacy had made claims on all 4 border states since the war's inception. Some Southern politicians demanded the border states be allowed popular sovereignty. This meant that the white males in these states would get to go to the polls and choose a side by ballot box. The Union fought back against this suggestion on a number of grounds. Union Army intelligence had already reported that Confederate agents had been pouring into the border states on a daily basis. Only days after this was discovered, the Republican Congress passed a bill that forbid a sovereignty vote within the border states. The Union would make sure they gave up as little as they could during the peace process. The post-war North. Entering 1866, tensions continued to simmer over the fate of the border states and the issue of slavery there. With a solid majority in Congress, the radical Republicans seized the opportunity to push through more legislation. It began with the passage of the 13th Amendment. This measure permanently ended slavery within the United States. This included the 4 border states and any U.S. territories. It was signed by President McClellan on January 17, 1866. In the short term, this move made the situation in the border states even more tenuous. There was an uproar among slave owners in the border states. They treated their slaves as property and accused the federal government of looting the border states and pillaging their wealth. Within months another bill was passed that allowed for paid emancipation. This was a system that was actually used in our timeline for slaveholders living within Washington, D.C. In our alternate timeline, the federal government would use a similar plan in Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware. The radical Republicans in Congress resisted compensating slave owners. Some felt it was simply immoral, while others feared it could bankrupt the federal government. President McClellan pushed Congress to pass the measure to keep the border states from running into the open arms of the Confederacy. Using the D.C. compensation model, slave owners would receive a one-time payment of $300 for each slave they owned. Their slaves would then be granted their freedom. This was met resistance by slaveholders as they argued their value was much higher. However, this was not an optional order, and the Union Army presence would there to enforce the measure. Reconstruction in the Confederacy. The end of the war was celebrated across the South. Their gamble had paid off, and they were now an independent nation. However, they grappled with challenges on multiple fronts. Confederate President Jefferson Davis had a year left in his single 6-year term. Davis wanted to make sure his legacy was secure before he retired. The continued existence of slavery in the Confederacy led to the ongoing issue of runaway slaves. 3.5 million African Americans remained in bondage within the Confederacy. Slaves would continue to risk their personal safety for the possibility of reaching freedom. Many already had family members waiting for them in the North. The Confederate government would use a portion of its military forces to police this issue. The Confederacy positioned their forces along the Mason-Dixon line to attempt to prevent slave escapes. Additionally, the Confederate Congress determined that there would be a need for a permanent military force. Both sides had built their armies largely by conscription. While many veteran and wounded soldiers would be discharged, hundreds of thousands would be kept active. The biggest obstacle faced by Jefferson Davis was the presence of Union military forces in portions of the Confederacy. These soldiers remained after the ceasefire. They were met with increased hostility by civilians in those occupied areas. Negotiations over the withdrawal of troops became a complex and contentious issue. The Confederacy demanding the restoration of full sovereignty and control over its territory. The Reconstruction efforts in the Confederacy involved significant efforts to rebuild war-torn cities, infrastructure, and its meager industry. The Confederacy had already sought foreign investment from European nations. Not all nations would be friendly to the Confederacy, and their peculiar institution. But, they possessed something that had been in short supply the last few years: cotton. At that time, the South produced 75% of the world's cotton. European mills suffered during the American Civil War. The Union Navy made trading with the Confederacy almost impossible. However, with the war concluded, most of the Union coastal blockade had been lifted. The South needed to get back to transatlantic trade as quickly as possible. Ultimately, it took a compromise to end the turmoil. At the time of the ceasefire, the Union Army held several regions within the Confederacy. Control of the Mississippi River was paramount to the Confederacy. In order to restore control to this vital region, the Confederacy had to rescind any and all claims to the border states. The Union Army was already occupying the majority of the territory in these states. Therefore, the Confederacy didn't have much bargaining power in that respect. After months of negotiations, the Compromise of 1866 was ratified by both nations. In early 1867, the Confederacy announced their intention to give up their claims to the border states. Slavery was officially ended in those states and slave owners were compensated for each slave they owned. The U.S. government enticed many of the slave owners into taking Western land grants in lieu of currency. By February of 1867, the Union Army had withdrawn its troops from the occupied regions of the South. However, occupied Tennessee was not quite as clear-cut. It was a Confederate state that the Union had occupied most of the war. It had both pro-Confederate and Unionist movements. After much debate, it was determined that Tennessee would serve as a semi-autonomous neutral state. Both armies would withdraw their soldiers, slavery would be abolished, and Tennessee would stay neutral. Tennessee's acting governor Andrew Johnson never became President of the United States as he did in our timeline. However, as governor of this neutral state, he would yield significant power and influence as his state would function as a quasi-independent state. Another issue that was addressed in this agreement was the status of Western territories. When it came to lands west of the Mississippi, the U.S. wanted to limit Confederate reach. The Union acceded to the Confederate claim on the southern portions of modern New Mexico and Arizona. They would take possession of the territory north of the Mexican border but south of the Missouri Compromise line. The Union would not concede any of California to the South. This prevented the South from gaining access to the Pacific Ocean. Ultimately, a fragile peace was achieved that prevented an immediate return to war. However, the long-term sustainability of this peace remained uncertain. 1867 was an election year in the Confederate States of America. Seeking to establish a stable government, Confederate leaders nominated Robert E. Lee. Even before the armistice, Lee was highly respected in the South. After the war, he is held at the same status as George Washington. Lee, burdened by the weight of the recent conflict and its devastating consequences, initially resisted the idea of assuming political office. However, as discussions and debates continued, he realized that his refusal might lead to instability or power struggles within the Confederate leadership. Lee accepted his nomination and was overwhelmingly elected the second president of the Confederacy. Following a distinguished political career, Jefferson Davis retired to his Mississippi plantation. In this alternate history, Jefferson Davis is viewed much more favorably. In fact, he would be viewed as having served his country with honor and distinction. He retires as a revered statesman in Confederate history. His retirement was marked by widespread admiration and gratitude for his steadfast leadership during the tumultuous years of the Civil War. With the torch passed to Lee, the Confederacy enters a critical phase of its history. Lee must use his leadership skills and political acumen to navigate the challenges of Reconstruction. The Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad played a crucial role in aiding enslaved individuals seeking freedom before and during the Civil War. It was a clandestine network of individuals, both free and enslaved, who worked together to assist enslaved people in escaping to free states or Canada. The network consisted of secret routes, safe houses, and individuals known as conductors, who guided escaped slaves to their destinations. In our alternate history, the intensity of the Underground Railroad escalates after the war as the United States government becomes directly involved. Following the war, the Freedmen's Bureau was established to assist newly freed slaves known as freedmen. Most had either escaped the South or had become recently emancipated in the border states. The Freedmen's Bureau assisted with basic needs such as food, shelter, clothing, medical care, and employment assistance. However, there existed a volunteer unit within the Bureau consisting of a small number of white males. These agents discreetly crossed into the South and there they would pose as slave traders, or plantation owners in search of labor. In some cases, they were able to purchase slaves from owners willing to sell, and secretly transported them north to freedom. These agents navigated the dangerous world of slave markets, forming connections in the South. They would also assist conductors and fugitive slaves on the Underground Railroad. The agents supplied support and logistical assistance. In this alternate history, the American Civil War took a different course, resulting in the independence of the CSA. This is simply one interpretation of what and how the Confederacy could secure independence in the Civil War. The war was marked by significant events, such as the South's victory at Harrisburg and the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln in 1862. As a result, the CSA secured its independence, retaining the brutality of slavery as a foundational institution, at least for now. Thanks for watching this episode of The Alternate Historian. Please be sure to like, subscribe, comment, and share the video. We really appreciate your support.